Freudian psychoanalysis, these theories that promise a solution, an explanation for everything. They're all-encompassing. You read Marxism, it explains why we have all problems we have. They can be explained away through this Marxist idea of the class struggle and how one class struggles against another, and when they get to power, they become oppressors, and this gives rise to another class, and this dialectical process. The same with Freudian psychoanalysis. You read a couple of pages by Freud, and you become a psychoanalyst already, and I'm sure many of you are. I mean, all of us are at some point. Because it's so easy, you know, to, whenever you have a little problem, to put the blame for your problem on someone else. And if you have a headache today, it must be because when you were little, this older guy kicked your shoulder or something, and now it's coming back to you through your unconscious, you know, all these traumatic experiences, all of this stuff. There is no science to that today. There may be some truth. I'm not saying there is no truth at all. There may be some truth to that, but nothing that can be empirically tested or experimentally tested. But back then, it was taken to be science. Marxism was taken to be officially a science in the Soviet Union until the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed. It was considered and called a science. And with evolutionary theory, well, it is still considered a science, although there are many. We talked about evolutionary theory in one of our past classes, so I'm not going to repeat the whole thing now, but it keeps some scientific status. But it's still one of those grand theories that explains also pretty much the whole of reality, you know, why everything is what it is, just because of this evolutionary process that Darwin discovered, you know. So that's the 19th century concept of science, this grand theory idea. Now, if you were in the second half of the 20th century and you look back at the Enlightenment project, what did you see? Would you feel that the Enlightenment project, the Enlightenment had delivered on its promises? A world at peace, rationally organized, with no conflicts, with science in the service of humanity, making our lives healthier and happier in all respects? Probably not. Definitely not a world at peace. If you look back to the first part of the 20th century, what you see is the two worst world wars ever. The most inhumane instances of massive killing. What you see is science in the service of political interests. Well, that's not what it was supposed to be, right? That's not what it was supposed to be. Now we have a problem here. Now, one person to see that was Michel Foucault, the French philosopher Michel Foucault. And with him, a number of other thinkers also came to the same conclusion. And we're going to talk about a couple of them at least. Michel Foucault, of course, noticed that the Enlightenment hadn't really delivered on its promise. Now, from a more philosophical viewpoint, what this entailed was that what we could call the motto of the Enlightenment, knowledge is power, knowledge is power, a statement that's due to Sir Francis Bacon, a 17th century British philosopher of the Enlightenment. Sir Francis Bacon, B-A-C-O-N. No, I'm sure you've heard that many times. Knowledge is power, right? It seems clear when we think of it that that's how things work, right? You know how to do things, that gives you power over your environment. You know how to type, you know how to use a computer, that will make you a lot more productive than if you don't. Okay? You know how to till the land, you can make it productive. You get a college degree, you can get a better job. So knowledge is power, meaning knowledge gives you power, makes you powerful. Well, Foucault says that implies that the idea that knowledge is there as an objective thing, and that there are no biases. Knowledge is kind of objective, like a rock in there, and we just grab it and it gives us power. He says, but that's not really the way things work. And he became really critical of this Enlightenment idea that knowledge is power. In fact, later on, he was to change that to the opposite. Power is knowledge. So knowledge is power. I'm going to call that the enlightened or modern paradigm. The word paradigm is a Greek word which means, technically it means example, but it's like the model, so to say. And then power is knowledge, which is how Michel Foucault states it. I'm going to call that the postmodern paradigm. The postmodern paradigm. Now, let me tell you about Michel Foucault, and then you will see why he grew suspicious of this situation with modernity, especially with the power of the scientists and their ability to manipulate knowledge. Michel Foucault was gay. He was a homosexual person. He was not open about it, and at least for most of his life. He had problems with that. At one point, he even decided to become a monk and just withdraw into a monastery. But then he changed his mind, and he became a philosopher. He was curious to know why homosexuality was considered a disease, a mental disease. And the way for him to find out was to write his PhD dissertation on psychiatry, on the history of psychiatry. Now, I'm creating this link, okay? He was gay, he was interested in the history of psychiatry. Not that he ever explicitly said, I'm doing this because I am gay, but the connection is there. He went to Sweden to do research on an important archive in there on the history of psychiatry, and his dissertation eventually was published. In English, the title is Madness and Civilization. Madness and Civilization. Now, when you read that book, a couple of things become obvious to you by the end of the book. A couple of interesting things. Number one, that when you see the treatments that psychiatrists have applied to the supposedly mad people throughout the ages, you really don't know by the end who were the crazy ones, were the supposedly crazy or the psychiatrists, because some of those treatments were really truly crazy. And the second one is that, hey, it turns out that what was called madness 100 years ago may not have been called madness 50 years ago. So someone who was considered to be crazy, mad, in, say, 1850, might not be considered mad in 1900 and not be put in an institution. And someone who was considered to be crazy, mentally imbalanced, sick in 1900, might not have been put in an institution in 1950. And someone who may have been sent to an institution for psychiatric treatment in 1950 may not be put in an institution today. Huh. I mean, I suppose you agree with me on that. That's it. When you think of it, you don't need to read a book to understand that, because it's pretty simple. Although the idea comes out clearly of Foucault's book. Say, if in a 1950s or 1940s or 1930s, as to say,